Probably nothing matters so much in all the world for us as humans as discovering why we were put here on the earth, hearing from our Creator and knowing what His will is for each of us. Sadly, one of the biggest hindrances to hearing that is just that there are so many people clamoring to tell us. And along with that, there's our own misguided desire for something other than the truth. Hearing from God is one of those strange paradoxes. Incredibly difficult. At the same time, it can be relatively easy. Now, I'm going to share something that has helped me a lot over the years. It kind of popped into my head way back in the early years of my marriage. It didn't come from anything I read in the Bible or from the teachings of Jesus, so it's a little dangerous for me to say that God told me it, yet I pretty strongly believe He must have, because it's been so reliable for so long. Here's how it went. I started thinking that God must have a lot of things He would like to tell me. Now, some of them I have picked up from the Bible and from other people, and I've run with them, pleased with what I've heard. But I was thinking that it's probably not those things that God would most like to get me to listen to. What He most wants to tell me, and which I have not heard, are things I don't want to hear. In other words, if God seems unbearably silent, it's probably because I have my fingers in my ears. I don't really want to hear what He wants to say. I'm too busy looking for ways to hear what I want to hear. So I started to approach prayer a bit like that. I would kind of brace myself for something that was not going to be easy to accept, trying to tell God and tell myself that I would accept whatever He felt I needed to hear if only He would speak. It worked. Even today, I do not do that often enough, but I have developed kind of a habit where I try to stay open to change. When I'm getting too soft, God seems to give me a prod to pull my socks up. And when I'm making things too difficult, He seems to give me a prod to back off. I have a feeling this is more or less what prophets of all sorts in Bible times experienced. They had developed this ability to hear what they did not want to hear. Think about it with Samuel, for example. He heard God rebuking him for feeling sorry for Saul when God was punishing Saul. How many of us are able to hear God when He disagrees with us? Especially when we're surrounded by all the false prophets in the churches who say things like, "Oh, come to me, my children, for I want to bless you, I want to heal you, I want to make you rich. Lean back and rest in my peace. Let me do it all for you." It's what we want to hear, isn't it? There are always grains of truth in what they're saying, but it's totally swamped, well, the gush that we so much want to hear. I think even the false prophets may have started out as genuine prophets, and that's what makes it so hard for their followers to distinguish between the truth, when it's coming from them, and the lies. I want to say a bit more about the lies. I really do think that most of us are right on the verge of delusion, if we're not deluded already. And it happens by little lies that we tell ourselves and others almost daily, with hardly a twinge of conscience about it. I'll illustrate this. How many times have you said, "Oh, we'll be praying for you," to someone who's grieving, and then you never really prayed for them at all? Or have you said, "I need a little time to pray about that," and then you never went and prayed about it? You went off instead and you thought about it. You talked to other people about it. And then, with your human reasoning, often based on what you prefer, you made a decision, your own decision, without God ever getting a word in edgewise. But you convinced yourself that it was God speaking. Truth be told, many of us probably would not know how to hear God tell us anything anyway. We have become accustomed to saying, "I feel God is telling me," when it's really our own human and often selfish reasoning that is really being heard. I think this, and I think that. Even when we're criticizing other Christians and other religious leaders, it's really just our own thoughts being expressed. We don't really have answers from God, just rumblings of discontent. Now, God may be trying to lead you, but it's like trying to lead a blind and deaf person. Other than physically pushing or pulling them in various directions, God has very little opportunity to communicate with them, or more correctly, with us, because we're not listening and we're not looking. When this kind of so-called relationship with God gets into the pulpit and onto the mass media, bad things happen. I've listened to preachers carry on as though they have two-way discussions with God as easily as they would with anyone else over the breakfast table. I was talking to God this morning, and he told me that I need to do such and such, and I said, but hey, God, what about such and such? And that's when God said such and such. You ever heard that kind of talk? Now understand, hearing from God is precisely what I'm advocating here. But I'm talking about absolute honesty with regard to what we hear. And it usually means, if we're going to be honest, that our communication with God is imperfect, stumbling at the best of times. I'm sorry, but I just don't believe this nonchalant banter that they pretend to have with God. I believe it probably started out as something like journalistic license. They were thinking about something, and various thoughts went through their minds, so they decided to depict those thoughts as a conversation between them and God. But the more they did that, the more deluded they themselves became, assuming that everything they thought was what God thought. Now, this is the apparently innocent start to what can end up as pretty strong delusion. And these days, we have pastors who will tell you that they have angels who speak to them, with heavenly answers for every question that they or anyone else might have. We have preachers who say that they've been to heaven and talked face to face with God. The bigger the story, the more people will believe them. And much of what they say can be quite reasonable stuff about trusting God and being good people. But I still think the overall effect is not good. And that's because they're not being totally honest. The rest of us feel intimidated by these exaggerations, so we just give up. We end up letting them do our thinking for us. After all, they have God's ear, and we don't. So deception grows, and that includes a lot of self-deception for the people who are doing this deceiving. Unfortunately, whole denominations have grown out of this kind of delusion. Even whole religions. Jim Jones, the leader of the ill-fated People's Temple in Jonestown, Guyana, pretended to pull cancers out of people's bodies. He got some of his closest lieutenants to cooperate with this on the grounds that it generated faith in the people. Now, that's not so different to Torben Sondergaard teaching his followers in the Last Reformation movement little tricks to imitate miracles. He calls it a way of kick-starting faith. No one really gets healed, but hey, it makes them think that it could work for someone else, if not for them, as long as they keep faking it. And so, the exaggeration grows. Joseph Smith got a great idea for a book about Jesus coming and preaching to Indians in America. He couldn't get a publisher to accept it, but he managed to convince some people that an angel had given him the book. And lo and behold, a whole new religion was born. Well, the book was about Jesus after all, and it included whole passages from the Bible, so a little deception to get people reading about Jesus, that was okay as far as he was concerned. Muhammad did much the same thing. An angel, he said, told him what to put in his book, and once again the book did contain a lot of good stuff about God, against idolatry, and about doing good. So a little exaggeration was justified. Along with this tendency for prophets to exaggerate their own revelations is an equally dangerous practice where the followers exaggerate things about the leaders, especially after the leader is dead and gone, when it's too late for people to challenge the distortions. We start declaring people infallible as though that makes it so. So, whether it's people saying that they have talked face to face with God, or whether it's their followers exaggerating things they said after they've passed on, the end result is that it does not generate more faith in God. What it generates is more faith in human leaders. We even exaggerate the infallibility of people like Paul or Moses to the point where they become excuses to ignore Jesus. We have some religious leaders trying to drag us back into the Torah and away from Jesus on one side, and other religious leaders trying to drag us into the so-called Romans way of Paul's epistles and away from Jesus on the other side. And it's all done through exaggeration. Okay, to be fair, the same thing can even happen with Jesus. and he knew it. We could just get ourselves all worked up over his divinity to the point where that's all that matters. Watch for it. When people start talking about who Jesus is and not what he said, that's exactly what is happening. Jesus called it saying, Lord, Lord, but ignoring what he taught. Now, most of you know that I say a lot about the 4 Gospels, but it's really the 3 Gospels that we most need to read and which are most ignored. Ask any preacher which of the 4 Gospels they think you should start with, and they'll all say the same thing. John's Gospel. Now, I personally don't have a problem with John's Gospel. I treat it as inspired by God. But what John wrote is almost certainly slightly exaggerated. He wanted to make it clear that Jesus was special, and so he has Jesus saying things that none of the other 3 evangelists ever quoted him as saying. I am the light of the world. I am the way, the truth, and the life. If you've seen me, you have seen the Father. To be honest, one of my favorite verses in all the Bible is where John says that Jesus was in the beginning with God, and he was God. Everything that was made by him. I believe this stuff about Jesus, but I believe it because I listened to the rest of what he said. Not just in John's Gospel, but in the other 3 as well, which are probably far more reliable historical documents. Never has a man anywhere ever spoken as he did. So if the churches really believe their own theology about who Jesus is, they should show it by more interest in what he said. But they're really not interested. So can you see how this tendency to exaggerate in order to drive a point home can end up distracting us from the real truth and what Jesus spoke? And can you see how we let this happen in our lives when we exaggerate our own divine authority? Now here's a little line from Billy Graham I just happened to stumble upon the other day, which is a good example of how we let style blind us to a lack of substance. Billy says, with that great authoritative style for which he was so famous, I am absolutely convinced. Now that's what we all want to hear, isn't it? We want someone with such certainty to lean on and trust when our own ability to hear that still small voice of God's Spirit is not working so well. Ironically, it's precisely because we put so much blind faith in our religious leaders, and that includes me, that we often lose our ability to hear the quiet proddings of God's Holy Spirit. So Billy started his sentence out with those comforting words, I am absolutely convinced, and he continues, that this could be the beginning of a great worldwide move of the Spirit of God. Did you catch it? Did you hear the hint of his true spiritual stature? This could be a move of the Spirit of God. Then again, it could not be a move of the Spirit. He's not absolutely certain at all. But no one wants to hear that. So he says, and we hear, what do we want to hear, don't we? We hear that Billy is absolutely certain, and so we can trust him, even more than we can trust our own imperfect understanding of God's will. Sadly, there are too many of us preachers out there saying what you want to hear, saying we have all the answers and you can trust us and never have to go through the agony of hearing what you don't want to hear from God. And of course, we say what you want to hear because then you tell us what we want to hear. That we're wonderful men of God, anointed leaders, blessed with marvelous gifts. The flattery rolls in and together we slip into delusion. It's happened in every religion throughout history. Legends, myths, superstitions, lies built upon lies. People everywhere saying, God told me, when he never told them any such thing. But the public loves to hear it. They have what the Bible called itchy ears, craving more and more myths and legends. But when you tear away all of the supernatural stuff, when you listen to what they're all saying, that's when you begin to appreciate what is really so special about Jesus. That is when he begins to shine forth as the sun. He's so much more than exaggeration and false charisma. He really is the light of the world. He is the way, the truth, and the life. He's the Son of God, the Savior of the world. He is the Word himself made flesh. But of course, you first need to listen to him. above all the exaggerations about everyone else, before you can truly appreciate that. You see, we only exaggerate the others because they and we need something to fill the gaps in our fallible human frailties. Jesus doesn't need that. His word speaks for him. Listen to him, and you will hear what it is that we all need to hear. You will hear why it is that our Creator put us on this planet. You will hear how it is that he wants us to live. And out of this, all the rest will grow. I think God told me this. But don't take my word for it. Listen to him yourself. As you listen to him, pray that God will give you an open heart to hear what your flesh does not want to hear. Pray that God will speak and that you will be open to listen. Hearing things you've never heard before and hearing them in a way that you've never heard before. Let the word speak as you have never let him speak before. May God bless you.